After Moses, Yahweh's servant, died, Yahweh said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Get ready. Cross the Jordan River. Lead these people into the land that I am ready to hand over to them. I am handing over to you every place that you set foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert in the south to Lebanon in the north. It will extend all the way to the great river Euphrates in the east, including all Syria, and all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to resist you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not abandon you or leave you alone. Thus begins the book of Joshua, the sixth book in the Old Testament in the Bible, normally seen as the beginning of the historical books or the historical prophets, the former prophets, the Nevi'im in Hebrew. This introduction here in the first 5 verses is going to set forth what's going to happen in the book of Joshua. The Israelites are going to enter the land, and they're going to conquer many parts of the land of Canaan. Joshua, we don't know exactly who wrote this book. We believe that it was compiled at some point before the days of David, since in Joshua 15, the author indicates that Jerusalem still belonged to the Jebusites, which was something that was true in Israel until David conquered it in the narrative we can see there in 2 Samuel. And it has a lot of consistency with Deuteronomy before it and Judges after it, as continuing to tell the story of how God fulfilled his promises and worked with Israel, his people. The events described, if we take 1 Kings 6 and verse 1 as indicating a legitimate historical number, would be somewhere around the year 1410 and would have probably taken place over a period of 30 to 40 years at most. And the book of Joshua is designed for Israel to understand how it entered the land and how it conquered the land, all the allotments of the land, and provides the witness regarding how they had testified that they would serve Yahweh as their God. And there is much that we can gain from it in considering a later Yehoshua, the name Joshua, which is also Jesus. Jesus certainly will also provide liberation and victory for his people. So the book of Joshua, the first 12 chapters kind of goes over the main body of the work that we associate with it, all of the fighting that Israel does. So in chapter 1, Joshua is told to get ready, and he tells all the Israelites to get ready to go and cross the Jordan. Remember, they're still on the eastern side of the Jordan. They're all getting ready to cross over onto the land of Canaan. In chapter 2, he sends out a couple spies into the land to spy out Jericho. They get to Jericho, they get to the inn of Rahab, the innkeeper or harlot. It's not exactly a place of reputable people, so to speak. And she hides the spies while there are the people from the king who come and ask about them, and she sends them off a different direction. So she just lies to preserve the lives of these men. And when she explains why, she says, I know Yahweh is handing this land over to you in Joshua 2:9. We are all absolutely terrified of you, and all who live in the land are cringing before you. For we heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you left Egypt, and how you annihilated the 2 Amorite kings, Sihon and Og, on the other side of the Jordan. And so because of that, she was motivated to help them with the proviso that they would preserve her and take care of her. And indeed, they make that promise, and that she would be preserved, her and her family. They put the scarlet cord in at her house. And she let them down out the wall in the back of her house. And then they went back and told Joshua what had happened, and Joshua learned that Yahweh is indeed handing the land over to them. All who live in the land would cringe before them. In chapter 3, we see how Israel crosses the Jordan River, how the priests would come with the ark. The waters parted, which was a significant thing. The water was probably at flood stage at this time of year. And they all crossed over. Each tribe took a stone, and they made it as a monument to demonstrate what had just happened. The stones had come from the bottom of the riverbed, which otherwise would normally have been inaccessible, save for the miracle that God had provided for his people. And so they all crossed over. And in chapter 5, we see the preparations. That generation was circumcised. Apparently they had not done that while in the wilderness. They observed the Passover. And it's at that time, we're told, that the manna ceased. They no longer ate of the manna because they were now in the land and were going to eat of the fat of the land. In chapter 6, we see the conquering of Jericho. Of course, the very famous story, the Israelites all march around it 6 times, once a day for 6 days. On the seventh day, they march around it 7 times, the horn gets blown, and the walls fall down. Of course, in the ancient world, walls are the primary source of defense. The lack of walls means that there was no ability to save the town. Everything was plundered, and Joshua made it clear it was to be under the ban. Everything was to be taken, everything was to be killed, nothing was to be taken for oneself. However, we see that Rahab and her family would be accepted because of the promise made to them. But as we learn in chapter 7, Achan, the son of Carmi of Judah, took some of the wealth for himself, and that angered God greatly. So when Israel next tries to conquer Ai, they set out a small expeditionary force which is humiliated and defeated. And Joshua and the Israelites are crying to God, trying to figure out what happened, and God indicates to them that somebody has taken stuff when they shouldn't have taken stuff from Jericho. And all Israel's assembled, and by lot it comes down to Achan. Achan confesses the stuff is found, and then he, his family, that stuff, his animals are all taken to a pit, stoned, and everything is burned up. And it's called the Valley of Achan to that day. After that, in chapter 8, the opportunity was then given where Israel would go up again against Ai. This time they had a stratagem where there would be men in ambush. Joshua would lead out the main part of the army that would flee at the sight of the Aites, who then pursue after them. And then the men in the ambush come and take the town. The men of Ai turn around, see their town is now the smoke coming up from it, and realize their predicament, and they are completely overwhelmed and destroyed, and their possessions taken by the Israelites in chapter 8. And to this point, that Joshua fulfills the command given to him by Moses, that on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, the people were there, and they read the law and the blessings and the cursings from those mountains. In chapter 9, we learn about the men and women of Gibeon. They see what's going on here, and they don't like it. They don't want to die this way. Now remember, Israel has been commanded to not make any alliances or treaties, to not preserve any of the Canaanites, that they all need to be wiped out of the land. That was very much insisted upon in Deuteronomy. And so the Gibeonites work to deceive the Israelites, and they act like they've been coming from a long journey and want to make a covenant with them. Important message in the verse 14 of chapter 9. The men examined some of their provisions, but they failed to ask Yahweh's advice. They did not consult God, who would have told them what's up with these people. And then Joshua makes an agreement with them that's sealed with an oath. 3 days later, they figure out that they're next door neighbors. And even though that the covenant was made under treacherous circumstances, which we would normally consider null and void in a court of law, they would honor that commitment, and they would become the servants of the Israelites. But the precedent's now been set. There will still be some Canaanites in the land because the Israelites are now bound by covenant to maintain the Gibeonites and not to harm them in any way. This has all really upset some of the southern kings. Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, saw what happened to Jericho and Ai, heard about Gibeon capitulating to the Israelites, and so he makes an alliance with some of these other more southern coalition of Amorite kings. Himself, the king of Hebron, Yarmouth, Lachish, and Eglon, and they would all go and attack Gibeon because they had allied with Israel. And so they go to attack Gibeon. Gibeon sends word to Joshua and the Israelites. Joshua and the Israelites march all night, take them by surprise, and attack on the next day. And there is a mighty battle against the alliance of the southern Canaanite kings. This is the day in Joshua 10 where it is said that Joshua prayed to Yahweh before Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Aijalon. That the sun stood still and the moon stood motionless so that Israel could inflict a greater defeat on the Canaanites. Because Yahweh was fighting for the Israelites at that time. The kings all flee to a cave at Makkedah. They're found there. A stone is rolled in front of them until Joshua can get there. They're taken out. They're hung up. They die. That is left as a testimony to what happened to them. And then Joshua leads a campaign against a lot of these cities. Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron. All of these cities are, and Debir, and all these cities are attacked, and they now become Israelite cities. The Israelites have defeated all of them. They're all now, all of this land to the south now has been conquered by the Israelites. In chapter 11, we learn of King Yabin of Hazor. He hears about what's going on to the south, and so he now develops an alliance. This is what the Canaanite kings have done for years, by the way, that they would all be normally petty city-state kings fighting each other until there was some other entity that would fight them, and then they would create short-term coalitions. But as we can see here, none of these coalitions are being able to stand. They're too hasty, and of course God is fighting for the Israelites. And so the kings of Shimron, Aksaph, and other northern kings come to fight against Israel. And they fight against Israel at the waters of Merom. And at that place, of course, God promises, and great victory is given. The Israelites absolutely defeat all of these Canaanites that are coming against them, and they take Hazor and burn it to the ground. The city is completely razed, according to the text. And then at the end of chapter 11 and chapter 12, there's a summary of all these victories and a list of all the kings that had been conquered by the Israelites, so that all that information would be well known and well established. As Joshua 13 begins, Joshua's very old, and God tells him that. You are very old. Must really love hearing that from God, right? And a lot of land is still needing to be conquered. And list out the land, and the assumption would be that future generations would be the ones who would have to conquer that land. Now came the time to divide up the land. And so the land, the way it was divided up, you go back to Genesis, you can see this forecast. You are going to start with your primary tribes, which is going to be Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Now, yes, provision is also made and described the fact that you still have half of Manasseh. Reuben and Gad have decided to keep the land of Sihon and Og between the Ammonites and the Moabites on the eastern side of the Jordan. That is listed out, and that the allotment is made for them. Then we have the allotment of Judah established, that they and their allotment is all delineated in chapter 14, and the cities and its boundaries are also in chapter 15. Then in chapter 16 and 17 is when the rest of Manasseh and Ephraim's land are also laid out. And what happens by chapter 18 is that then all the rest of the Israelites are joined together, and there are lots for different lands. Different land segments are established for the other 7 tribes to get their land. And that is when Benjamin gets its allotment. So does Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. And of course, Dan's land, they will not be able to conquer, and they will end up taking land up near Sidon, which is also described here in Joshua, but will be in greater detail there in Judges. You see Joshua receives his land. You see earlier Caleb and Judah receives his land, and some of the details there will also be mirrored in Judges chapter 1, when Othniel is able to conquer some things there and will become the first judge of Israel. So in this way, Judah has its land. Simeon actually is within Judah. The Levites, of course, are spread throughout. Benjamin is just north of Judah. And Ephraim is north of them, and Manasseh is near them, and also on the east with Gad and Reuben. And the rest of the tribes kind of center around various portions of the land of the Sea of Galilee. And that is how the land ends up being allotted. In chapter 20, they designate the cities of refuge, right? If somebody commits a capital crime or something that looks like a capital crime, they can flee there to avoid the avenger of blood if they have committed especially involuntary manslaughter. And also Levitical cities, the lands of the Levites and all the apportionment they are to receive are laid out in chapter 21. And in chapter 21, we've got this great affirmation that the Lord gave Israel all the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors, and they conquered it and lived in it. Yahweh made them secure in fulfillment of all he had solemnly promised their ancestors. None of their enemies could resist them. Yahweh handed all their enemies over to them. Not one of Yahweh's faithful promises to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Every one was realized. So at this point, everything had reached its fulfillment. So what's left is sending back the men of Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh. They had come across to help fight for the land as they promised. They were going to return to their land east of the Jordan River. And chapter 22 talks about a major intertribal incident where they build this huge altar, and all Israel is ready to go fight. They're ready to go fight. They're thinking they're committing idolatry. That's already bad news. But before they go fight, they send Phinehas and a delegation who cry out, "Don't do this. Come live in our land. We'll make room for you if you're going to do this kind of stuff." But the people of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh explain what they were doing, that they built this altar not for sacrifice, but as a memorial, in case any future generations of the Israelites of the west would say that these Israelites of the east aren't really Israelites because they're not west of the river. And when this is told, Phinehas and the people are satisfied, and a civil war is here averted. Chapter 23, Joshua is very old, and he brings Israel all together and encourages them to be faithful and not to fall away from Yahweh their God. And Joshua ends with the assembly of all the tribes at Shechem. And Joshua rehearses Israelite history in chapter 24. And he talks about how Abraham's father was an idolater. Terah was an idolater in Mesopotamia. And how God called Abraham and made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and delivered them from the Egyptians, and gave them victory over Balaam, and then over Sihon and Og, and now all of the land of Canaan that had been given. All of that had been done by God's work. God had done all of that for them. And so the exhortation now was to obey God, to put away all those gods from that their ancestors served in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. Now, if they don't want to worship God, then they should determine that day what God they should worship. They want to worship the Mesopotamian gods, the Egyptian gods, or the Amorite gods, whatever gods. But this is, of course, where Joshua says very famously, I and my family will worship Yahweh. And the people respond, far be it from us to serve these other gods. Yahweh's our God. Yahweh's done all this for us. We will serve Yahweh. And Joshua warned the people, you're not going to keep doing this. You're not going to be faithful. God will be jealous and he's going to punish you. They said, no, we are going to serve Yahweh. And so this is now established as a testimony for them, that they had affirmed that Yahweh is their God and the covenant is re-ratified. That yes, they are going to serve God. They recognize that God has brought them into this land, all of the things that God has done in their history, and that God has been faithful. And after this, Joshua dies at 110. Joseph's bones are brought in and properly buried. Eleazar dies and Phinehas continues. So we see the next generation continuing. Israelites are now going to be in their land. And at this point, things seem well. Israel seems to be faithful at this point. All seems to be going well at this point. We can see from the book of Joshua how God had proven faithful. And a lot of times we talk about like the Pentateuch, right? The first 5 books as Torah, as in that kind of coherent thing, and Joshua beginning the historical section. But we can also look at it in terms of the Hexateuch and understand the beginning of the Bible from Genesis through Joshua. Because as we saw there in Joshua, God has proven faithful. Everything God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses meets its fulfillment in Joshua. God proves faithful. Israel can now see and know that God has done what he said he will do. God is faithful. And that was the core lesson Israel was to take from all of this. And unfortunately, Israel, even if they recognized God's faithfulness, did not prove faithful to him. Now, of course, it is for us to see in it that Joshua could not really give them rest because of their disobedience in Psalm 95. And it would be another Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, who would come and provide the means for rest by serving him and obtain the resurrection of life in him. Therefore, we do well to understand what's going on in the book of Joshua, glorify and honor God because of his faithfulness, and find life in his Son, Jesus Christ. So glad you've joined us today. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the book of Joshua, we'd love to find out. Please let us know and to let us know in the comments, and subscribe to us, and share if this has been beneficial to you. I'm Ethan with the Venice Church of Christ. We are a non-denominational church of Christians in Los Angeles, and we'd love to be of encouragement to you. Can we pray for you? Would you like to study the Bible with us? Would you like to meet with us? Can we be of any other service? Please reach out to us at VeniceChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on social media, all kinds of places at Venice Church or Venice Church of Christ. Thanks again, and may the Lord bless and keep you until we will meet again.